Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Abraham Denmark. Abe is the director of the center's Asia program and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. But he joins us in a different capacity today. He's the author of this new book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, Empowering Allies and Partners. Abe, both welcome and congratulations on reaching the finish line on this piece of epic work.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you.
So, Abe, as I was reading the book and preparing to speak to you, I was thinking that going back decades, I could think of a Time magazine cover with the rising sun talking about the dawn of the Pacific century. And, and in the book, you say it's the world's most geopolitically important and dynamic region. So I guess we're done waiting for the century to start. Is it here?
I think it's here, and I think it's been here for a while. If you look at statistics, economic statistics for a while, really until the COVID crisis, about 1% of global GDP was moving to the Asia Pacific annually. And so that's a tremendous amount of economic power moving to the region, both in terms of the rise of China, but also the rise of India, other rising economies in Southeast Asia. And they're translating that into political influence, military power, to the point where what happens in Asia has dramatic effects around the world, not only economically, but also politically. And as we've learned this year, in terms of public health as well.
So how long ago did you start working on this?
Far too long ago. I actually started it about 5 or 6 years ago, before I went into the Pentagon. And I had to shelve it when I went into the Pentagon. And then when I came out and it was time to get back on it, I had to rewrite pretty much everything, both based on what I'd learned, but also because of the election of President Trump and his very different view of allies and partners that I thought really recast the subject of this study in a very interesting way. So I really wanted to dig into these issues in a more fundamental way than I probably would have otherwise.
Another thing you say in the book is that the U.S. faces profound challenges in the region. Give us an overview. What are you talking about? What are the challenges?
Well, there's the challenges that most folks understand of China's rising power, China growing more assertively. China growing more assertive in the expression of its power. Concerns and questions about the reliability of American power, whether or not we could actually be there and be engaged. And all these questions were actually happening before President Trump, actually before President Obama came to power. So these have been happening for a long time, but they really started to intensify. And one of the arguments of the book is that we're talking about something that's bigger than any of these one issues. That it's not that all these pieces really form to combine changes to the regional balance of power. And one of the arguments I make in my book is that historically, looking at the Indo-Pacific, that as the balance of power in the region has changed, so too has the regional order, the operating system of how the region works in terms of laws, norms, that's changed from Chinese hegemony to the rise of Japan to American leadership after the war, and that as that balance of power has changed, the regional order has changed as well to reflect that. So the argument that I make is that we're seeing a change in the balance of power, and that's going to likely drive changes to the liberal order itself, and that we need American leadership both to sustain liberal principles, but also to shape where this new regional order is heading in a way that's conducive to our interests.
Is the current power structure automatically a threat to the liberal world order, or is that just one possible outcome?
It's just one possible outcome, that a lot will depend on American leadership and how we orient towards order. And as the book argues, that it will require the United States to invest itself, to build its own power and adjust its strategies to be more applicable to the way power is working in Asia in the 21st century, but also empowering our allies and partners, that they can be tremendous geopolitical assets for the United States to sustain liberal principles, to advance interests that we share. The current administration has really cast our alliances and our partners as burdens, as problems that we need to overcome, as unfair. But my belief and the argument of the book is that really these are tremendous assets and something that would be very helpful, both in terms of competition with China, but also in terms of sustaining liberal principles as the order evolves.
In the book, you write about how your thinking evolved from not just how we could do more, but focusing on the question of why we should do more. Can you speak a bit about that?
Sure. The Trump administration's arguments about allies needing to do more are not new. They've been happening for administrations for a long time, encouraging our allies, especially in Asia, to do more. But what this book gave me the opportunity to do is to really ask the question, why? What do we want them to do? What's the purpose of this? What's the strategy of this? And to me, that really also reflects an aspect of competition with China, that there's a lot of people around Washington who'll talk about the United States competing with China, but there's really not much discussion of the purpose of that competition. Competition is not a goal, it's a tactic, it's a strategy. And there needs to be a defined goal of what we're trying to achieve, both in terms of competition with China, but also in terms of working with our allies and partners, encouraging them to do more. And so to me, sustaining liberal principles as the order evolves is a very worthwhile project and goal, both in terms of competition with China, but also in terms of as an objective for why we're trying to empower our allies and partners.
That liberal world order was built when there were two competing ideologies that created some clarity and the alliances that formed around those. I feel as there's almost been drift ever since the end of the Cold War because that clarity has been lost. What defines this competition within the Indo-Pacific region? And really, as you suggest, it can't be isolated to the region. It really has global implications. So how do you see that competition, those competing ideologies, how do you define them now?
Well, I think in terms of a liberal order, I think it's important to caveat that critics who don't agree that that a liberal order is a thing tend to point out that, especially during the Cold War, it wasn't terribly liberal, it wasn't terribly orderly, which I think is true. But it's also, I think, more of a case of sort of something of a platonic ideal in terms of an ideal that you're trying to get to and trying to make progress towards. Towards the end of the book, I talk about the United States talking about establishing a more perfect union and sort of having that attitude towards recognizing the challenges and trying to make progress. In terms of the competition, I see that the United States has a tremendous amount of interest in preserving these liberal principles, that they've been critical to the peace and stability that Asia has enjoyed for decades, which really enabled its rise. The reason we're having an Asian center is because of this liberal order. It's helped China as much as anybody else, and that we have an interest in sustaining it. But it also includes a deep analysis of China and their orientation towards the order. You'll hear a lot of people talking about how China's revisionist, China's trying to take over the world. And I don't take that view. But I also don't take the view that China's rise is benign. I actually think it's quite problematic. But they're coming at it from a very different point of view. Their objective is to make the world safe for China. And it's very self-centered. It's not really focused on providing public goods or any of those things. There's a phrase that Chinese diplomats use a lot that I talk about in my book called a he butong, which translates roughly as a harmony, not uniformity. It's a reference to an old Confucian aphorism saying that a gentleman aims at harmony, not at uniformity. The idea is that the man aims at uniformity as a way to emphasize traditional Confucian relationship between benevolence and propriety. And I think we saw a great deal of this recently with the Chinese ambassador to the United States, who was interviewed and was asked about how the world should orient towards China. And his response was, is the United States ready or willing to live with another country in peace? And this is in reaction to asking about Chinese assertiveness that we've seen really terrible examples of over the last few months. And that to me was a great example of what I was talking about, of he butong, that China is going to do what it wants. It's going to try to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, and the rest of the world really needs to fall in line.
I'm sure you've heard the old adage about we're always fighting the previous war. and particularly your time in the Pentagon, I'm sure that's something that haunts planners at the Pentagon, that notion that we're always a step behind. In regard to China, are we applying a Soviet paradigm when we're trying to understand China? And does that consequently lead us to some faulty assumptions?
Those who do talk about the US-China competition as sort of a new Cold War, I think it does lead us to some incorrect conclusions about the nature of this competition. The Cold War was existential. There was no room for the two ideologies to exist incompatible with one another. They existed in two separate systems. And it was primarily military in nature. Whereas with China, we're integrated into the same system. We're each other's most important trade partners. I should say China's one of our top exporters are actually our most important economic partners are Mexico and Canada. But for China, we're extremely important. They're part of the same system. We're not trying to end China as a political entity. They're not trying to end us. And it's not military. The competition is not military in nature. It's economic, it's political, there's a military dimension to it, there's ideological dimension to it, but it's a much more complex, much more difficult to understand on a bumper sticker than what we had during the Cold War.
Your book, not only, it's useful for someone who is expert on the region, but it's also a great primer for someone who isn't. And one of the key things it does is it offers a vision for how to move forward. We seem to be rudderless right now, or at least limited. President Trump's vision seems to be transactional and more about economics than any grander vision, certainly not defending the kind of liberal world order that you have some concerns about. Where can that vision thing come from? Do you see possibilities among whether it's congressional leadership or elsewhere where the United States could move forward in a more coherent manner in the type of blueprint that your book provides?
There's a lot of thinking going on in this area that I think is very helpful. Also within the Trump administration, there's some terrific minds there who are doing very good work towards a lot of these issues. And you do see mentions of liberal order within some of the Trump administration's documents. The challenge, of course, that they have and that we have is that the president doesn't agree with it, as best as we can tell. So I think there is a path forward about how the United States could adjust to this. In terms of investing in its own capabilities. Job one, I think, is to empower the United States in terms of reinvigorating military posture, but also trade policy, more diplomats into the region, engaging with them more deeply than we had been before. The Obama administration famously had to pivot or rebalance. To me, that was a good first step, but there needs to be more of that. In terms of broad engagement with the region across all elements of national power, not just military. And a key part of that is going to be our allies and partners and really using them as the assets that we can. We're positioned to lead. If you look at Pew polling, there's a tremendous amount of interest in the region. They want the United States to lead the region. They're worried about us. I'm talking about our allies and partners now. They're worried about us, but they want us there. They see us as the only country that can credibly push back against the Chinese. They have an interest in sustaining this liberal order as well, but we need to be there. And we've seen in the past, during the Nixon administration, there was this idea of empowering our allies and partners, but it was accompanied with a strategy of American pulling back and saying that other than nuclear deterrence, you all are on your own. And that was a pretty bad failure. We saw a lot of countries looking at building their own nuclear weapons in response. So this needs to be a 1-2 punch of reinvesting in the United States, investing in what makes us strong and our strength, our advantages, but also empowering our allies and partners so that they can do more, they can contribute to this project, and we can work with them together towards our shared objectives.
In the book, you profile some of these allies. Who are the key allies? What nations are the key allies?
Well, I think there's a lot of key allies, and the challenge that you have in writing a strategy about Asia is that there needs to be a framework that is applicable to every country, but at the same time is flexible enough that you can adjust because each country has very different perspectives, very different ideas about what they want to accomplish. Sometimes they don't get along with one another. So I tried to really strike that balance. Japan, of course, is very important for the United States and has been since the beginning of the alliance. but so too is Korea. South Korea is going to be a very important partner for us. And part of the book talks about how we need to start thinking about South Korea beyond the Korean Peninsula, that it's not just about North Korea, but South Korea has a lot of interest in these liberal ideas as well, about this liberal order as well, working with them as well, but also talking to countries like Australia, India, Indonesia, Singapore, Taiwan has an important role to play, the Philippines potentially, New Zealand has an important role to play, especially in the Pacific Islands. So there's a lot of different features, but the main point of the book, one of the main points of the book, is that countries are going to be measuring power. They're going to be looking at the United States and China and trying to see who has an advantage across multiple dimensions of power. That it's not just who has the stronger military, but who has a more attractive 5G regimen, who has a more attractive trade policy. And countries will be picking and choosing. I call it functional spheres of influence. And the idea from an American perspective is that if we're able to invest in these things, we can have the confidence that more countries would want to be in the American sphere of influence on these various areas than on the Chinese areas. And different countries will have different interests and will be interested in engaging in these different areas of aspects of national power than others. So we need to be able to broaden and diversify our approach to strategy and engage across the board the way that the Chinese are. They see all these as integrated. They're moving out on all these pieces, and we need to be able to meet them in every aspect of national power, or else we cede the ground to them.
In that regard, is your book a challenge to the U.S. to really get its act together and exploit the advantages that it has?
I'd say it's a bit of a challenge in terms of identifying the problems that we have, that they're quite significant, but also saying that this is something that's very doable, that it's an optimistic piece, I think. It says that we have the capability to lead, that the region, for the most part, if you're not counting China and North Korea, want us to lead. And it's in our grasp, that it's going to take some difficult choices. It's going to take some prioritization. It's going to require some innovation and operating in ways and in places that we've not done before, in ways that we haven't done in a long time. But if we do that, if we change our approach in a way that's reflective of how power is operating in Asia and its importance and the true complex nature of our competition with China, then I have every confidence that the United States can continue to lead, even as geopolitical power moves from Europe to Asia.
And that would be a perfect optimistic closing thought, but I'm going to mess it up by asking you one more question, which is, look, every book has to end, right? You have to reach the finish line, and there's always the potential for another chapter as things change. You happen to come to the finish line at a time of enormous, potentially global change in the midst of a global pandemic, unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. So the COVID-19 implications for China, does it change any of the fundamentals or any of your conclusions? Will people be less willing to jump on the China bandwagon as a result of the way the pandemic has played out and its origins in Wuhan? Is there another chapter, in other words, that you'd like to begin writing right now?
Well, I don't know who coined the phrase, but they said that a project is never finished, just abandoned. I actually finished the manuscript just before the pandemic started. So the timing there was especially interesting. I do think that the book is still very relevant. I think it fits right in. I would write the same exact book as I would have before, just probably added a chapter on coronavirus. To me, the strategic impact of the coronavirus, at least so far, has been to be an accelerator. That the trends that I saw happening before are happening still, but at a much faster and more intense rate. In terms of Chinese assertiveness, in terms of questions and uncertainties about American power in the region, about our allies and partners working together more than they had been before. And the challenge that our allies and partners have, the questions that I identify in the book, are at the forefront of every discussion happening in the Indo-Pacific outside of Beijing and Washington. This idea that they don't like the Chinese, they don't trust the Chinese, but the Chinese are capable, the Chinese are very powerful, and they're close. They're not going away. Whereas the Americans are far away, and there's questions about whether or not we'll be there, whether or not we have the capacity anymore to be there, or the will. So I think the next few years are going to show them a great deal about whether or not the last 3 or 4 years have been a bit of an aberration, or if it signals a significant change and that they can't really count on the United States anymore the way that they had been before. So I think COVID has highlighted a lot of these issues, that there's problems with engaging with China. But at the same time, it's also, I think, laid bare a lot of the weaknesses of the United States and intensified a lot of those fears that some of our friends had about our reliability, about our dependability.
Well, Abe, and as this all plays out, I have no doubt that your voice and your insights and analysis will play a major role in contributing to the discussion, as this book does. Congratulations again. It's a terrific work. U.S. Strategy in Asian Century, Empowering Allies and Partners is the book. Abe Denmark is the author. Thank you for joining us today, Abe, and best of luck in getting the word out about this work.
Hey, thanks. Good to see you, John.
Good to see you as well. Thanks to our viewers and listeners for joining us for this edition of Wilson Center Now. You can look forward to future episodes. And again, Wilson Center Now is available both in video format, but as an audio podcast if you prefer that. So we'll be back again with another edition of Wilson Center Now. Hope you'll join us. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.